On a cool and breezy autumn afternoon, the sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Judge Marcus Holloway drove home after a long day at work. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and the world seemed calm and quiet. Marcus was not just any man. He was a respected judge known for his fairness, wisdom, and dedication to justice. For years he had served on the local circuit court, earning admiration from colleagues and community members alike. But today, none of that mattered. Judge Holloway decided to stop by a small grocery store near his neighborhood to pick up a few essentials before heading home. He parked his car in the nearly empty lot, unaware that this simple errand would soon turn into an unforgettable ordeal. As he stepped out of his vehicle, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot behind him. The officer inside noticed something about Marcus's car, a broken taillight. It was a minor issue, one that most people would overlook or fix without much thought. But this tiny detail set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. The officer who approached Marcus's car was named Ryan Callahan. Known around the precinct for his tough demeanor and strict adherence to rules, Officer Callahan had a reputation for being overly aggressive during traffic stops. Some called him diligent. Others whispered that he used his authority to intimidate those he deemed suspicious. Today, however, there was no room for whispers, only actions. As Officer Dio Callahan stepped out of his cruiser, his boots echoed against the pavement. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, and his face wore an expression of stern determination. Without waiting for Marcus to roll down his window or acknowledge his presence, Callahan shouted, "Keep your hands where I can see them." His voice cut through the stillness of the afternoon like a knife. Startled but composed, Judge Holloway turned toward the officer. He kept both hands visible on the steering wheel and replied calmly, "Is there a problem, officer?" His tone was polite, measured, and respectful, qualities that came naturally to him after years of presiding over courtrooms filled with tense situations. But instead of easing the tension, his words seemed to fuel it further. Callahan ignored the question and demanded identification. "License and registration, now!" he barked, leaning closer to the car window. Marcus nodded slightly and reached slowly toward the glove compartment, explaining as he moved, "I'm getting my documents. Everything's in order." But officer, Callahan didn't hear or perhaps didn't care about the explanation. To him, every movement looked suspicious, every second felt like an eternity, and every gesture, no matter how innocent, seemed like a potential threat. Before Marcus could even pull out his license, Callahan yanked open the car door and ordered him to step outside. The judge complied, raising his hand slightly to show he posed no danger. "Officer," he said firmly but patiently, "I'm Judge Marcus Holloway. I work at the courthouse downtown. This must be some kind of misunderstanding." For a brief moment, Callahan hesitated. Could this man really be a judge? Dressed in jeans and a sweater, he didn't fit the image Callahan had in mind when picturing someone of such importance. Besides, judges weren't supposed to drive cars with broken taillights, or so Callahan convinced himself. Shaking off any doubt, he tightened his grip on Marcus's arm and snapped, "Save it for the station, you're coming with me." Bystanders began gathering around the scene, curious about the commotion. A young mother pushing a stroller stopped to watch, her eyes wide with confusion. An elderly man walking his dog paused mid-step, shaking his head disapprovingly. Even the cashier inside the grocery store peeked out the window, wondering what all the shouting was about. Someone started recording the incident on their phone, capturing the escalating confrontation between the two men. "Do you know who this is?" a woman in the crowd called out, pointing at Marcus. "That's Judge Holloway. He's a judge." But Officer Callahan wasn't swayed. In fact, the mention of the title only seemed to irritate him more. "Everyone says they're somebody important when they get caught breaking the law," he shot back, tightening the handcuffs around Marcus's wrists. The judge winced slightly but remained silent, knowing that arguing wouldn't help. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, determined not to let anger cloud his judgment. As Callahan led Marcus to the patrol car, the judge couldn't help but notice the growing number of phones aimed in their direction. People were filming, snapping photos and whispering among themselves. Social media platforms would soon buzz with clips of the arrest, each frame telling a story of power, dynamics, assumptions, and systemic biases. For now, though, all Marcus could do was sit quietly in the back seat of the cruiser, his mind racing with thoughts of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. What struck Marcus most was the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a man whose life revolved around upholding justice, being treated as if he were guilty until proven innocent. The irony wasn't lost on him, yet, despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface, he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he resolved to handle the situation with grace and dignity, trusting that truth and reason would eventually prevail. Little did Marcus know, the events unfolding in that grocery store parking lot were just the beginning of a much larger saga, one that would capture national attention, spark heated debates, and leave an indelible mark on society. For now, however, he sat silently in the patrol car, watching the world blur past the window as Officer Callahan sped away, leaving War behind a crowd of stunned witnesses and a trail of unanswered questions. As Judge Marcus Holloway sat in the back seat of the patrol car, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. The handcuffs around his wrists felt cold and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. His mind raced with thoughts about how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. He replayed the events in his head, the officer's aggressive tone, the accusations, the way he'd been treated like a criminal, despite offering no resistance. It was surreal, almost dreamlike, but the hard metal of the cuffs reminded him that this was all too real. Officer Ryan Callahan drove silently, his jaw clenched tightly as if bracing himself for whatever might come next. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every so often, Callahan glanced at Marcus through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Was it suspicion, anger, or perhaps something else? Guilt, maybe? Marcus couldn't tell, and frankly, he didn't care to know. What mattered now was figuring out how to de-escalate the situation before it got worse. "I'm still waiting for an explanation," Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the same authority he used in court when addressing unruly defendants. "You haven't told me what I'm being detained for." Callahan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Broken taillight," he muttered curtly, not bothering to look back. "And failure to comply." "Failure to comply?" Marcus repeated, incredulous. "I was reaching for my license and registration exactly as you asked. How is that failing to comply?" Callahan didn't answer. Instead, he turned up the radio slightly, filling the car with static-filled chatter from the police scanner. It was clear he wasn't interested in having a conversation. To him, Marcus was just another suspect, a nameless face in a sea of people he dealt with daily. But to Marcus, this wasn't just another day. This was personal. The patrol car pulled into the precinct parking lot moments later, its tires screeching slightly as it came to a halt. Callahan stepped out, slamming the door behind him, and walked around to open the back seat. "Out," he ordered, gesturing sharply. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, careful not to make any sudden movements that could be misinterpreted. As he climbed out of the car, he noticed a small crowd gathering near the entrance of the station. News traveled fast in this town, and word of the judge's arrest had already spread like wildfire. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was chaotic, yet eerily routine. Officers bustled about, answering phones, typing reports, and chatting casually, as if nothing unusual was happening. For them, this was just another shift. But for Marcus, every moment felt surreal. He was led to a holding area where paperwork would supposedly be processed, though the process seemed unnecessarily slow. Each minute dragged on, amplifying his frustration. At one point, another officer approached Callahan and whispered something in his ear. Marcus couldn't hear what was said, but the exchange made him uneasy. Were they discussing his case? Doubting his identity? Or worse, planning to hold him indefinitely without cause? The uncertainty gnawed at him, fueling his determination to resolve the situation swiftly. Finally, after what felt like hours, Marcus was given the opportunity to make a phone call. He dialed the number of Captain Harris, a senior officer he'd worked with during community outreach programs. Their relationship wasn't particularly close, but Harris respected Marcus's commitment to justice and understood the importance of accountability within the department. "Captain Harris speaking," came the gruff voice on the other end of the line. "Captain, this is Judge Holloway," Marcus began, keeping his tone measured but urgent. "I've been detained under questionable circumstances and I need your assistance." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Judge Holloway? What happened?" Marcus explained the events leading up to his detention, emphasizing the lack of communication and the disproportionate response from Officer Callahan. By the time he finished, Harris sounded both shocked and concerned. "Stay put," the captain instructed. "I'll handle this personally." While waiting for Captain Harris to arrive, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of his predicament. Here he was, a man whose job was to ensure fairness and uphold the law, being treated as if he were above reproach simply because of the color of his skin. He thought about all the times he'd presided over cases involving wrongful arrests, racial profiling, and systemic biases. He'd always believed in giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, trusting that the system would eventually correct itself. But sitting there in that sterile holding area, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and harsh fluorescent lights, he realized how naive he'd been. By the time Captain Harris arrived, the precinct was buzzing with activity. Word of Marcus's detention had reached higher-ups, prompting a flurry of calls and emails demanding answers. Harris greeted Marcus with a mixture eventual apology, extending a hand to shake. "Judge Holloway, I'm deeply sorry for this misunderstanding. Let's get you sorted out right away." Though relieved to see a familiar face, Marcus knew apologies weren't enough. "Thank you, Captain, but this isn't just about me," he said firmly. "This kind of behavior reflects poorly on the entire department. Something needs to change." Harris nodded solemnly, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. "You're absolutely right. We'll conduct a thorough investigation into Officer Callahan's actions. In the meantime, let's get you home." As Marcus prepared to leave the precinct, he couldn't shake the feeling that this ordeal was far from over. Outside, reporters and cameramen had gathered, eager to capture footage of the unfolding drama. Flashes went off as he stepped into the cool night air, and microphones were thrust toward him, each reporter shouting questions faster than he could process them. "Judge Holloway, can you comment on your arrest? Do you believe you were targeted because of your race? What message does this send about policing in our community?" For a moment, Marcus considered ignoring them altogether, but then he stopped, turned to face the crowd, and spoke with quiet conviction. "What happened today shouldn't happen to anyone. Not to me, not to anyone else. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about ensuring fairness for all. And until we address the biases and flaws in our system, incidents like this will continue to occur." His words hung in the air, powerful and profound. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, capturing every syllable. Cameras zoomed in, focusing on the weary yet determined expression on his face. Though exhausted, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The fight for accountability, and for true justice, was just getting started. By the time Judge Marcus Holloway stepped out of the precinct, the world had already begun to react. The footage captured by bystanders in the grocery store parking lot had spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Within hours, hashtags like #Justice for Holloway and racial profiling exposed dominated Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook feeds. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, airing clips of the arrest alongside interviews with community leaders and legal experts. What started as a routine errand for Marcus had transformed into a national conversation about race, policing, and systemic injustice. As Marcus stood outside the precinct, surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras, he felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, but also resolve. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been wrongfully detained, humiliated, or mistreated because of their skin color or socioeconomic status. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that claimed to serve everyone equally but often fell short of that promise. Back at the precinct, Captain Harris worked quickly to contain the fallout. He called an emergency meeting with senior officers to discuss how to handle the growing public outcry. "We can't ignore this," Harris said, firmly pacing the room. "People are watching. If we don't act decisively, it'll make us look complicit." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Officer Ryan Callahan, meanwhile, sat silently in a corner, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't anticipated the magnitude of the backlash his actions would provoke. What he thought was a routine traffic stop had spiraled into something far beyond his control. Word of the incident reached influential figures in the community almost immediately. Civil rights activists, lawyers, and even politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. Marcus's colleagues from the courthouse organized a press conference to express their support. "Judge Holloway is one of the most respected figures in our legal system," said District Attorney Lisa Monroe during the event. "To see him treated this way is not only unacceptable, it's a wake-up call for all of us. We must address the biases that allow such incidents to occur." Protests began to form organically throughout the city. Groups of people gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "Respect the robe and end police brutality." Marchers chanted slogans calling for justice and reform, their voices echoing through the streets. Among them were young students, parents with children in tow, and elderly citizens who had lived through decades of similar struggles. The energy was electric, a mixture of anger, hope, and determination. Inside the precinct, tensions ran high. Officers debated whether Callahan's actions were justified or an overreach of authority. Some defended him, arguing that he was simply following protocol. Others quietly admitted they saw shades of bias in his behavior. Meanwhile, internal investigators reviewed body cam footage from the arrest, searching for answers. The video painted a damning picture. Marcus had remained calm and cooperative throughout the encounter, yet Callahan's tone and actions suggested hostility from the start. As the investigation unfolded, leaked snippets of the footage made their way online, further fueling public outrage. Viewers could clearly see Marcus explaining himself, reaching slowly for his documents, and offering no resistance. Yet Callahan's response was aggressive and disproportionate, treating a minor infraction as if it warranted a full-scale arrest. Comment sections exploded with reactions, ranging from disbelief to fury. "Why does this keep happening?" One user wrote on Twitter, "How many times do we have to see innocent black men treated like criminals before something changes?" Another added, "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." Amidst the chaos, Marcus tried to focus on what mattered most, using this moment to drive meaningful change. He declined multiple interview requests, choosing instead to channel his energy into advocacy work. Over the next few days, he met with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and policymakers to discuss potential reforms. Together, they drafted proposals aimed at addressing racial profiling, improving police training, and increasing transparency in law enforcement practices. One evening, Marcus found himself sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers and notes. His wife, Lisa, placed a cup of tea in front of him and sat down beside him. "You've been through so much," she said softly. "Are you sure you want to take this on right now?" Marcus looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. "I don't have a choice," he replied. "If I don't use my voice to speak up, who will? This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Lisa nodded, understanding the weight of his decision. She had always admired her husband's dedication to justice, but seeing him navigate this ordeal firsthand gave her a new level of respect for his strength and conviction. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on the police department to take action. Calls for Officer Callahan's termination grew louder, with petitions circulating online and gathering thousands of signatures. Local officials held town hall meetings to hear directly from residents, many of whom shared personal stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. These accounts painted a sobering picture of a system riddled with inequality and mistrust. In response, the police chief issued a statement promising transparency and accountability. "We are committed to ensuring that all members of our community are treated fairly and with respect," he said. "An independent review board will be established to investigate this incident thoroughly, and appropriate disciplinary measures will be taken based on their findings." While some praised the announcement as a step in the right direction, others remained skeptical. "Words are cheap," one activist commented during a live stream. "What we need is action, real, tangible change that holds officers accountable and rebuilds trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve." As days turned into weeks, the story continued to dominate headlines. Late-night talk show hosts joked about the irony of arresting a judge, while daytime television featured heated debates between guests representing different sides of the issue. Documentaries and podcasts began exploring the broader implications of the case, drawing parallels to other high-profile incidents of racial profiling and police misconduct. Through it all, Marcus remained steadfast in his mission. He understood that lasting change wouldn't happen overnight, but he refused to let the momentum fade. Every speech he gave, every meeting he attended, and every proposal he helped draft brought him closer to his goal: creating a world where justice truly meant fairness for everyone. Despite the challenges ahead, Marcus found solace in knowing he wasn't alone. Across the country, people from all walks of life rallied behind him, inspired by his courage and resilience. Together, they formed a united front, determined to turn pain into progress. And though the road was long and fraught with obstacles, Marcus knew that every small victory counted, a reminder that even in the darkest moments hope could shine through. The days following Judge Marcus Holloway's arrest were a whirlwind of activity, both for him personally and for the broader community. The story had taken on a life of its own, with people from all corners of the country chiming in, some offering support, others demanding answers, and many calling for systemic change. For Marcus, the attention was overwhelming but also empowering. He knew he had an opportunity to channel this moment into something meaningful, something that could spark real progress. As promised, the police department launched an independent investigation into Officer Ryan Callahan's actions. A panel consisting of community leaders, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement experts was assembled to review the evidence impartially. Body cam footage, witness statements, and internal records were meticulously examined. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Not only had Callahan overstepped his authority, but his behavior reflected deeply ingrained biases that had likely influenced countless other interactions over the years. During one particularly charged town hall meeting, residents voiced their frustrations directly to local officials. "This isn't just about Judge Holloway," said a young woman named Tanya, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's about my brother who got stopped for no reason last year. It's about my neighbor who was handcuffed in front of his kids because someone thought he looked suspicious. When does it end?" Her words resonated with the crowd, drawing murmurs of agreement. Another attendee, an older man named Mr. Carter, stood up slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. "I've lived in this city for 50 years, he began, his voice steady despite the weight of his years. "And I can tell you nothing has changed. We're still treated like second-class citizens. If we don't hold these officers accountable now, when will we ever see justice?" The raw honesty of these testimonies struck a chord with everyone present, including the officials seated at the front of the room. They exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the public's patience was wearing thin. Promises alone wouldn't suffice. Concrete action was needed. Meanwhile, Officer Callahan found himself increasingly isolated. Once confident in his methods, he now faced intense scrutiny, not only from his superiors but also from colleagues who began questioning whether his behavior aligned with the values of the department. Some officers distanced themselves from him, fearing guilt by association, while others quietly expressed sympathy for Marcus. "What if it had been me?" one officer admitted during a private conversation. Would I have reacted differently, or would I have made the same mistake? Callahan, however, remained defensive. In interviews with investigators, he insisted he had followed proper protocol and denied any wrongdoing. He didn't identify himself as a judge until after I detained him, Callahan argued. How was I supposed to know? But the body cam footage told a different story. Investigators noted that Marcus had calmly identified himself early in the encounter, yet Callahan dismissed his explanation entirely. Worse still, the tone and mannerisms captured on video suggested preconceived assumptions about Marcus, based on his appearance, a pattern that raised serious concerns about implicit bias within the force. As the investigation progressed, pressure mounted on the police chief to take immediate action. Protesters continued to gather outside the precinct daily, their numbers growing larger with each passing week. Local businesses displayed signs in their windows showing solidarity with Marcus, while schools incorporated discussions about racial profiling into their curriculums. The movement, inspired by Marcus's ordeal, showed no signs of slowing down. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the Independent Review Board released its findings. Their report was scathing, concluding that Officer Callahan had acted recklessly and violated multiple departmental policies. Among the recommendations were calls for his termination, mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, and the implementation of stricter accountability measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Supporters of Marcus celebrated the decision as a victory, though many acknowledged there was still much work to be done. Critics of the board's ruling accused them of being too harsh, arguing that Callahan was simply doing his job. Tensions flared once again, highlighting the deep divisions that existed within the city. For Marcus, the outcome was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt vindicated knowing that Callahan's actions had been formally condemned. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the fact that this kind of scrutiny was rare, and often reserved for high-profile cases like his own. What about the others? He asked during a press conference shortly after the verdict. The ones without platforms, without privilege, who speaks for them? His question lingered in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore. It served as a reminder that while this battle had been won, the war against systemic injustice was far from over. In the wake of the decision, state legislators introduced new bills aimed at addressing racial profiling and promoting transparency in law enforcement. These proposals included measures such as requiring officers to wear body cameras at all times, establishing civilian oversight committees, and mandating regular audits of police conduct. Civil rights organizations praised the initiatives, urging lawmakers to pass them swiftly. Marcus threw himself into advocating for these reforms, attending hearings, speaking at rallies, and collaborating with activists to draft policy recommendations. His efforts earned him widespread admiration, but they also came at a personal cost. Late nights spent poring over legislation left him exhausted, and the constant media attention took a toll on his mental health. Yet, whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself why he was fighting, to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Lisa joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've done so much already," she said gently. "Don't forget to take care of yourself too." Marcus smiled faintly, appreciating her concern. "I will," he replied. "But I can't stop now, not when we're finally starting to make progress." And progress there was. Slowly but surely, changes began to take shape. Police departments across the state started adopting stricter guidelines for traffic stops, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity training. Community forums became more frequent, fostering dialogue between residents and officers. Even small gestures like officers introducing themselves by name during interactions helped rebuild trust in neighborhoods where it had long been broken. Though challenges remained, Marcus allowed himself to feel a sense of hope. This fight wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about creating a system where accountability was the norm, not the exception. And as he looked out at the horizon, bathed in the golden light of dusk, he knew the journey was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, he felt optimistic about what lay ahead. Months had passed since the day Judge Marcus Holloway was detained in that grocery store parking lot, but the ripple effects of the incident continued to shape lives and policies across the city and beyond. The termination of Officer Ryan Callahan marked a turning point, not just for the police department but for the broader conversation about accountability and reform. Yet, as Marcus often reminded himself, removing one problematic officer wasn't enough. Real change required addressing the root causes of bias and ensuring that systems were rebuilt from the ground up. The state legislature moved quickly to pass several landmark bills inspired by the reforms Marcus and his allies had championed. These included mandatory implicit bias training for all law enforcement officers, the creation of civilian oversight boards with real power to investigate misconduct, and stricter guidelines for traffic stops and detentions. One particularly groundbreaking measure required body cam footage to be reviewed regularly, not just when complaints arose, to identify patterns of behavior that might indicate bias or abuse of authority. But legislation alone couldn't fix everything. For Marcus, the next step was fostering understanding between communities and law enforcement. He began hosting monthly dialogue sessions, bringing together residents, activists, and officers to discuss their experiences openly. At first, these meetings were tense. Officers often felt defensive, while community members struggled to trust those in uniform. But over time, honest conversation started breaking down barriers. One evening during one of these sessions, a young mother named Jasmine shared her story. She described how she had been pulled over multiple times while driving through predominantly white neighborhoods, even though she hadn't broken any laws. Her voice cracked as she recounted the fear she felt each time an officer approached her car, wondering whether she'd make it home safely to her children. Across the table, a veteran officer named Detective Simmons listened intently. When it was his turn to speak, he admitted, "I've never thought about what it must feel like to be on the receiving end of those stops. Hearing your story makes me realize how much work we still have to do." Moments like this gave Marcus hope. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but every small step toward empathy and understanding mattered. By creating spaces where people could share their truths without judgment, he believed they were planting seeds for a better future. Meanwhile, Officer Callahan's life took a dramatic turn after his firing. Stripped of his badge and facing mounting legal fees, he retreated from public view, grappling with shame and anger. Some former colleagues reached out, urging him to reflect on his actions and seek counseling to address the biases that had influenced his behavior. Others distanced themselves entirely, unwilling to associate with someone whose reputation had become synonymous with controversy. Callahan eventually found work as a security guard at a local mall, a far cry from the authority and respect he once commanded. Though bitter about his fall from grace, he couldn't deny the weight of the criticism directed at him. Late at night, alone in his apartment, he replayed the events of that fateful day in his mind. Had he misjudged Marcus? Could he have handled the situation differently? The questions haunted him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he had served. Back in the spotlight, Marcus became a symbol of resilience and dignity. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences, universities, and community events. His speeches weren't fiery calls to arms, but rather thoughtful reflections on justice, fairness, and the importance of listening to marginalized voices. Audiences hung on his every word, moved by his ability to turn personal pain into purpose. At one such event, a national summit on criminal justice reform, Marcus delivered a speech that left attendees speechless. Standing before a packed auditorium, he began by recounting the details of his arrest. He spoke candidly about the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of strangers, the frustration of having his identity dismissed, and the realization that his experience was far from unique. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "But the truth is, it does happen, to countless individuals who don't have the privilege or platform I do. And until we acknowledge that reality, we can't truly call ourselves a just society." He went on to outline specific steps needed to create lasting change. increased funding for community programs, greater transparency in policing, and a commitment to dismantling systemic racism. Reform isn't just about punishing bad actors, he emphasized. It's about building systems that prioritize humanity over hierarchy, compassion over control. The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in admiration. Among them was Governor Elena Martinez, who approached Marcus after the session to commend him for his courage. "You're inspiring a movement," she told him sincerely. "And we're going to need leaders like you if we want to see real progress." As the weeks turned into months, Marcus noticed subtle shifts in the way people interacted with law enforcement and with each other. Officers in his city began introducing themselves by name during routine stops, explaining why they were pulling someone over instead of barking orders. Residents, too, seemed more willing to engage constructively, reporting concerns directly to oversight boards rather than resorting to protests or social media outrage. Even the media played a role in shaping the narrative. Documentaries and investigative reports highlighted stories of successful partnerships between police departments and communities, showcasing models that could be replicated elsewhere. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Still, Marcus remained vigilant. He knew that progress was fragile and that complacency could undo years of hard work. To ensure momentum didn't stall, he partnered with educators to develop curriculum modules teaching students about civil rights, civic responsibility, and the importance of holding institutions accountable. He also launched a mentorship program connecting young people from underserved neighborhoods with professionals in fields like law, journalism, and public service. Through it all, Marcus leaned heavily on his support network, his wife Lisa, his colleagues, and the countless strangers who had reached out to thank him for speaking up. Their encouragement reminded him that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Together, they were forging a path forward, one rooted in justice, equality, and hope. By the end of the year, Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall alongside community leaders, activists, and elected officials to celebrate the implementation of the new reforms. As balloons floated skyward and cheers echoed through the square, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride. The road ahead would undoubtedly be long and fraught with challenges, but for now, they had achieved something remarkable. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said into the microphone, addressing the jubilant crowd. "Change doesn't happen because of one person or one moment. It happens when we come together, listen to each other, and refuse to settle for anything less than fairness for all." His words hung in the air, carried by the wind to ears eager to hear them. In that moment, Marcus realized that his ordeal, painful as it had been, had ignited a spark that refused to dim. And as he looked out at the sea of smiling faces, he knew the fight was worth it. The months following the implementation of the new reforms brought a mix of triumphs and challenges, but one thing was undeniable. Judge Marcus Holloway had sparked a movement that extended far beyond his hometown. What started as a single incident in a grocery store parking lot had grown into a nationwide dialogue about justice, accountability, and systemic change. People from all walks of life, students, teachers, activists, lawmakers, and everyday citizens, were inspired by Marcus's courage and determination to turn personal adversity into collective progress. One crisp spring morning, Marcus stood on stage at a national conference dedicated to criminal justice reform. The room buzzed with anticipation as attendees filed in, eager to hear from the man whose story had become synonymous with resilience and advocacy. Clad in a sharp navy suit, Marcus exuded calm authority, his presence commanding respect without saying a word. When he finally stepped up to the podium, the audience fell silent, hanging on every syllable of his opening remarks. "Justice isn't just an abstract concept," Marcus began, his voice warm yet firm. "It's something we live or fail to live every day. It's in the way we treat each other, the policies we create, and the systems we build. And if those systems are broken, it's our responsibility to fix them." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "When I was detained last year, I experienced firsthand what so many others face daily: fear, frustration, and a profound sense of injustice. But I also realized something else. That my position gave me a unique opportunity to speak out and demand better, not just for myself but for everyone who doesn't have a platform or privilege. As Marcus recounted the events of that fateful day, his tone shifted between reflective and resolute. He didn't shy away from describing the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of strangers or the anger he felt when his identity as a judge was ignored. Yet he balanced these raw emotions with a message of hope, emphasizing how even the darkest moments could lead to meaningful change. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he said, leaning slightly forward as if addressing each person individually. "It happens every day to black men and women, to immigrants, to anyone society deems other. But here's the truth. No one should have to endure that kind of treatment. No one should be judged by their appearance instead of their actions. And no one should feel unsafe simply existing in public spaces." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement or scribbled notes in their notebooks. Some wiped away tears, moved by his vulnerability and conviction. Others leaned forward, visibly inspired by his call to action. Marcus then turned his focus to solutions, outlining practical steps communities could take to address systemic issues. He spoke passionately about the importance of education, urging schools to incorporate lessons on civil rights and social justice into their curriculums. "We can't expect people to understand the value of fairness if they've never been taught its history," he explained. "Knowledge is power, and empowering future generations starts with teaching them the truth." He also highlighted the role of technology in promoting transparency. Body cams, dash cams, and public access to police records were critical tools, he argued, but only if used responsibly. "Accountability isn't optional. It's essential," Marcus emphasized. "And while cameras can't solve everything, they remind us that someone is always watching, including ourselves." But perhaps the most impactful part of his speech came when Marcus addressed the human side of reform. "Policies matter, yes, but so do relationships," he said, gesturing toward the diverse crowd before him. "If we want to heal the divide between law enforcement and the communities they serve, we need to invest in trust. That means listening to each other, acknowledging past wrongs, and working together to find common ground." By the time Marcus concluded his remarks, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. Many rose to their feet, cheering not just for the man on stage but for the vision he represented. A world where fairness wasn't negotiable, where dignity wasn't conditional, and where justice truly served everyone. Afterward, Marcus spent hours engaging with attendees during breakout sessions and networking events. Lawyers sought his advice on handling cases involving racial profiling, while educators asked how they could integrate his ideas into their classrooms. Young activists eagerly shared their own initiatives, seeking guidance on scaling their efforts. Through it all, Marcus remained approachable and humble, treating each interaction as an opportunity to learn as much as to teach. Back home, the reforms continued to gain traction. Officers reported feeling more connected to the communities they served, thanks in part to the dialogue sessions Marcus had championed. Residents, too, expressed cautious optimism, noting improvements in how they were treated during routine encounters with law enforcement. Even small gestures like officers handing out business cards after traffic stops helped rebuild trust in neighborhoods where skepticism had long prevailed. Still, Marcus knew there was no room for complacency. Progress wasn't linear. Setbacks were inevitable. In nearby cities, similar incidents of racial profiling reminded him that the fight was far from over. Each headline reignited his determination to push harder, reach farther, and amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. To ensure momentum didn't fade, Marcus launched a nonprofit organization called Justice Beyond Borders. Its mission was simple yet ambitious: to advocate for equitable treatment under the law, regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic status, or zip code. The organization provided resources for victims of discrimination, hosted workshops on bias awareness, and partnered with policymakers to draft legislation addressing systemic inequities. Through Justice Beyond Borders, Marcus also created a mentorship program, pairing young people from underserved communities with professionals in various fields. Lawyers mentored aspiring attorneys, Journalists guided budding writers, and entrepreneurs helped teens develop business skills. The goal was to empower the next generation to break cycles of poverty and inequality, equipping them with the tools needed to navigate and ultimately transform the system stacked against them. As the years passed, Marcus's legacy grew. Schools named auditoriums and scholarships in his honor, recognizing his contributions to education and civil rights. Documentaries chronicling his journey inspired viewers worldwide, sparking conversations about privilege, bias, and the power of perseverance. Even Hollywood took notice, adapting his story into a feature film that further amplified his message. Yet despite the accolades, Marcus remained grounded. He often joked that fame was fleeting, but justice was forever. His true measure of success wasn't in awards or headlines, but in the tangible impact he saw around him. Families who once feared stepping outside now walked their streets with pride. Young people who doubted their potential now dreamed boldly, knowing someone believed in them. And officers who once viewed residents as adversaries now saw them as partners in creating safer, stronger communities. On a quiet evening years later, Marcus sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Lisa joined him, placing a cup of tea beside him. "You've done so much," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "Do you ever stop and think about how far we've come?" Marcus smiled, savoring the warmth of the moment. "Every day," he replied, "but I also think about how much farther we still have to go. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And as long as there's work to be done, I'll keep moving forward." In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the love of family, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His ordeal had tested him in ways he never imagined, but it had also given him purpose. Pain had transformed into passion, anger into action, and despair into hope. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, Marcus faced them with unwavering resolve. Because for Marcus Holloway, justice wasn't just a career or a cause, it was a way of life. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and demand fairness, the dream of a more just and equitable world would continue to shine brightly, lighting the path for generations to come.